Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dave Rosenberg.
Thank you very much. Apologies, I was a few minutes late, but we put some very bad traffic in different places. But I'm really, really pleased to be invited to give a talk on this slice of history that sadly is becoming more relevant the further we move in time from the events I'll describe. And for all the reasons that have just been laid out, the issue of fascism is very, very pertinent now internationally. As a writer, educator and tour guide, I try to convey what is called a history from below, focusing on rebellious grassroots movements that have generally emanated from the left. But in the early 1930s, the fastest growing radical and rebellious movement was one from the far right that threatened, if it succeeded, to destroy all the gains made by radical left-wing campaigns over many decades. And that movement was the British Union of Fascists, formed in October 1932 by Oswald Mosley. Or let's give him his proper title, Sir Oswald Mosley. Do you know what he did to become a Sir? He was born. Or actually, no, his full title, Sir Oswald Mosley, 6th Baron of Ancoats. And Ancoats is an area in Manchester. And my wife's nephew, Mark, who lives in Manchester, says the Baron of Ancoats sounds like the local drug dealer. But by early 1934, Mosley's movement had gained 40,000 paid-up members from all classes of the population, organised in 500 branches nationally, plus a large hinterland of supporters. It began to shift direction over the late summer of 1934, after it hit the buffers, when a 15,000-strong rally it held at Olympia that June descended into a horrific display of open violence against hecklers. So no heckling. And the generous support it had been receiving from various businesses, the prowess it gained from having Lord Rothermere, publisher of the largest circulation daily paper then, the Daily Mail, platforming and praising its anti-democratic far-right ideas, that began to dissipate. Rothermere distanced himself a little bit from Mosley, claiming that he couldn't support violence, which is weird really, because Rothermere was an absolute die-hard supporter of Hitler right up to the day of the Second World War. And in those years, of course, Jews in Germany were subject to repeated acts of violence and other acts of repression. Mosley was taken by surprise at the presence of hecklers inside the Olympia rally, a strictly ticketed event. It was actually Rothermere's fault that the anti-fascists got in, because he was running a competition in the newspapers he published, saying if you write a letter, get your letter published, you get £1, which was worth something then, and a ticket to a rally, a Mosley rally. Now, some clever anti-fascists wrote but the condition was the letter had to begin with "Why I like the black shirts," and that's the name of the British fascists. Yeah, some clever anti-fascists wrote spoof letters about why they liked the black shirts, got tickets, and forged some more. Yeah. So there were around 100 anti-fascists dotted around the room of 15,000. There was a large anti-fascist protest outside Olympia, organised by the two organisations that had already been active in exposing the fascist threat, and that was the Communist Party and the Independent Labour Party. The ILP from 1932 had become fully independent from Labour. The Labour Party itself had little involvement in active anti-fascism, save for the Labour League of Youth, who became increasingly militant anti-fascists and cooperated closely with the Communist Party. The Daily Mail described the protesters outside Olympia, a disorderly red mob largely composed of aliens, filling the air with obscene and blasphemous cries. I should hope so. Whereas it said the audience inside had many people well known in all walks of life, representative of the best elements of the British nation. And who they were. Well, it actually included 150 members of Parliament in there, who were genuinely looking for inspiration, and mainly from the Tory benches they were there, and also a group of people from the House of Lords who turned up in their black shirts to that meeting. But in its next phase, after Olympia, the British Union of Fascists decided to, instead of being a really national organisation, it would aim to build a power base and a working class based street movement in a small number of inner city areas. In London from October 1934, that focus was on the East End of London, where it built 4 active branches in Shoreditch, Bethnal Green, Bow and Limehouse. And those branches, if you drew a line between them, it would form a kind of horseshoe around the struggling Jewish working class enclave in Aldgate and Whitechapel. But in terms of wider areas of East London, several of which at that time fell within southwest Essex, Mosley's movement maintained a cross-class set of supporters. An East Ham branch was already operating from October 1933. And then there was a branch that had opened on Lea Bridge Road in Leyton shortly after that. And by early 1934, a Walthamstow branch too. Before the iconic year 1936, when Mosley would try to invade the East End with thousands of uniformed, jack-booted fascists to terrorise the most heavily Jewish-populated streets, his organisation's most dramatic East London indoor meeting, was not in Shoreditch, Bethnal Green, Bow or Limehouse, but in Stratford Town Hall in July 1935, organised by Arthur Bevan, who was a working-class activist who headed their West Ham branch. Mosley met bitter opposition there from anti-fascists. The Stratford Express said it needed several hundred foot police and 20 mounted men to keep order as demonstrators taunted the fascists. And actually, Mosley's speech was largely drowned out by the noise of all this. Now, my own commitment to offering a history from below is allied with an attempt to put the past into a conversation with the present. So as I described the 1930s, I hope you will hear echoes and resonances. In the last part of the talk, I will say more explicitly what I think we can learn from this history and use for the benefit of anti-racist and anti-fascist movements today, while also warning against making simplistic parallels that assume exactly the same tactics will once again work in newer and different contexts. Many writers have talked about history repeating itself, and though I quite like Karl Marx, I prefer Mark Twain's comments on this, who says history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. That's clever. And so listen for those rhymes. So Mosley, the aristocrat, first entered Parliament in December 1918 as a newly elected Tory MP for Harrow when he was barely 22 years old. He fell out with the Tories over Ireland. He fought and won further elections in Harrow as an independent with no party machine behind him. Along the way, he married Cynthia Curzon, who was born in India, where her dad had quite a big job. He was the viceroy. But under Cynthia's influence, Mosley switched to Labour and was a Labour MP from 1926 until February 31. And he was on the left of the Labour Party, around the Independent Labour Party. Yeah? In the late 1920s and early 30s, Britain was suffering from the global economic crash. Unemployment was rocketing, And during that time, he was spending many evenings, this is Mosley, in exclusive gentlemen's clubs in the company of his close friends, the economist John Maynard Keynes, the former diplomat Harold Nicholson, and a guy called Winston Churchill. And he was trying to interest them in a new hybrid political project, which Mosley unimaginatively called the New Party. And that was launched in March 1931. Nicholson signed up to it and edited their monthly newspaper. Keynes and Churchill were impressed but didn't sign up. And the New Party prepared to contest elections, offering left-of-centre economics but a very right-wing political style, embracing ultranationalism and militarism, arguing for dictatorship instead of democracy. So how was it then that this aristocratic wannabe dictator was able to get a hearing among the poorest population in East London? Well, here's a quote from a less well-known member of the fascist movement called Clement Bruning, but it might shed some light. Bruning joined Mosley's movement in his early 20s and became a regular columnist for the Black Shirt, their weekly newspaper. And he wrote this in 1935. The most surprising phenomenon in the growth of British fascism is the great popular support we have gained in East London. It would be superficial merely to attribute this strength to the natural and healthy anti-Semitism, which is always to be found in areas thickly populated by Jews. The cause is found deeper in the character and history of East London, the people there, not so well fed or housed as are the inhabitants of more prosperous London, have a deeper patriotism, deeper loyalty to tradition than is found in the suburbs, where the sickly, enervating propaganda of so-called modern thought has softened the fibre of British youth. Fascism appeals to the sturdy East Ender because it recognises the value and dignity of labour. We are winning wholehearted adherents because we have preached a cause and system bringing hope and sunlight into lives darkened by long years of hunger, squalor and despair, because we have shown them the way to cast off the foreign yoke of a domineering, all-pervading Yiddish culture which strives to make East London take on the character of Odessa or Warsaw. Now, there's a lot in that quote, yeah? Bruning talks about sunlight and hope, not hate. His surprise seems genuine. He acknowledges people's suffering, talks of hunger, squalor and despair, but he's also adept at mobilising that despair against the foreign yoke of the Yiddish culture, etc., highlighting how the East End has dramatically changed. And he believes it's very much for the worse. It's a racist model that other far-right personalities from Enoch Powell to Nigel Farage have also used. What happened to Bruning a few years later is quite bizarre, actually. In 1939, he'd moved to Germany and worked in Frankfurt for a German news service. After war was declared, he was interned in a castle with 100 other British detainees. During an inspection, a Gestapo officer asked him in a provocative manner, "Are you Jewish?" Bruning said no, and he wrote to the Foreign Office in London to send proof of his Aryan ancestry. Bruning's father was indeed German, but under Nazi laws, that made Clement Bruning an Auslander, a German citizen abroad. His British citizenship was disregarded. He was called up to the German army to fight for the Nazi fatherland. Despite his love of fascism, Bruning felt loyalty to Britain, and he refused to fight. He was treated as a conscientious objector, sent to a concentration camp in southern Poland, where he died of TB in 1941. Yeah. He's buried in Krakow. Live by fascism, die by fascism, I guess. But that same month, it's a weird story, isn't it? But that same month, when Mosley created the British Union of Fascists, there was a conference about unemployment held in the East End by a radical left-wing churchman called Father Grosser, who was based at a church near Watney Market. And he sent a letter inviting people to the conference that noted the effects of unemployment, the frustration of personality, the loss of proper self-respect, the creation of an embittered and hopeless section of the community. And unknowingly, he was describing the key characteristics that would make them ripe for recruitment by fascists, who promised to restore their dignity, empower them with a renewed sense of identity and purpose. That legendary Labour figure, Tony Benn, identified the ingredients for social change as hope and anger. And in the 1930s, it was the fascists, much more than the Labour Party, who offered hope and anger to struggling communities. Just a drop of water. When Mosley first created his party, his anti-Semitism was relatively muted, but not completely absent. The very first public meeting that the fascists held was in Farringdon, in the same hall where the Labour Party was founded in 1900. It was a group of about 50 people there, including 3 people who were heckling. And Mosley, in this instance, deals with it with sarcasm. He says, what have we got here? 3 warriors of the class war. And then he says, and every one of them from Jerusalem. It's a completely gratuitous statement. And I don't know if they were Jewish or not, but if they were, they're more likely to come from Warsaw or Ukraine than Jerusalem. But anyway, but there were stewards there looking threatening. And they were known colloquially as the Biff Boys. And they had been created in the New Party phase before it transmogrified into the British Union of Fascists. And they were trained up by 2 sportsmen employed by Mosley. One was Peter Howard, captain of the English rugby team at the time, and Oxford educated. The other was a boxer from the East End called Ted Kid Lewis. Now, Kid Lewis was his name in the ring. His real name was Gershon Mendelov. He was from a Russian Jewish family of immigrants. And he was one of Mosley's bodyguards as well, you know, and he followed Mosley into the British Union of Fascists. Although at least he did have the excuse that he'd probably been bashed on the head a few times. But there was a small Jewish membership of the British Union of Fascists in its first year and a half or so. And a number of them were Jewish businessmen in the city, organised as something called the Jewish Economic Forum. And but through 1933, the party was discussing what they call good Jews and bad Jews. Funny enough, that's a topic that's come up, isn't it? The good ones were the ones that were seen as very patriotic, very assimilated. The bad ones were bad because they keep bad company, and they're very internationalist in their outlook. The bad company was they have friends in the Communist Party. And by late 1933, the emphasis was very much on the bad Jews, and Jews were banned from becoming members of the fascist party. I mean, they weren't exactly queuing up. But anyway, what happened to Ted Kid Lewis? Well, the story is that about halfway through 1933, he had a one-to-one with Mosley and asked him quite pointed questions about Mosley's attitude to Jews. He didn't get very satisfactory answers, so he did what he was good at, and he punched Mosley and left the party. You can see his name actually on a plaque. The plaque is on a Jewish care home for the elderly in Wandsworth. And I used to visit a friend there who's now moved to a different care home. But every time I went there, I'd see this plaque on the outside. It said, Ted Kid Lewis, championship boxer. And I really wanted to edit it and say, and Mosley's bodyguard, you know? But he lived out the last few years of his life there anyway. But by late 1934, anti-Semitism took centre stage in fascist ideology. And it was the glue that melded all the elements together. A way of explaining the world which increasingly expressed itself as conspiracy theory. Every social, political and economic problem was put down to something called alien Yiddish finance. Sadly, in our own times, conspiracy theories are coming to the fore once again from the far right, flooding the internet, and sometimes people who think of themselves on the left are susceptible to them. It wasn't straightforward, though, for Mosley's party to convince impoverished East End non-Jews of this theory. Although anti-Semitism was deeply embedded in British culture and negative stereotypes were expressed from all classes, but especially the upper classes, the Jews that the poor non-Jews in the East End encountered were often as poor as them. Yeah? So the fascists set about convincing them that this was a facade, that the poor Jews in the East End were somehow in league with the richer Jews in the West End. Some of them may have wanted to be, but they weren't. And that Jews were dangerous and devious, engaged in all kinds of criminal activity, ran prostitution rackets, couldn't be trusted. And where people encountered Jews locally, Jews with power over them as employers or landlords, it was perhaps easier to convince them that this was because that landlord is Jewish or that employer is Jewish. The ideologues in Mosley's movement worked really hard to make potential recruits believe anything about the Jews. There were two other elements that helped the fascists in these arguments as they set about building their strength in East London. One was that there had been an earlier experience of political organising against Jewish people there. The main immigration of East European Jews to the East End was from 1881 and they were fleeing pogroms in Tsarist Russia. London's Jewish community rapidly expanded, especially in that traditional immigrant quarter of East London. Between 1901 and 1905, there was a populist, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee organisation, the British Brothers League, led by upper middle class elements who lived in the City of London and beyond, including the Tory MP for Stepney, Major William Evans Gordon. And they built a 12,000 strong membership among very poor people just beyond the Jewish enclave, convincing them that all their problems were caused by immigrants, and utilising them as foot soldiers on protests, large indoor meetings, street marches, petitions. The British Brothers League dissipated after it basically got what it wanted from the government. And it got that in 1905, there was Britain's first modern peacetime immigration law, known as the Aliens Act. It was meant to keep out people like my grandmother, who was a difficult person. But you wouldn't necessarily pass a law against her. And anyway, but she got in anyway. And that was passed by a government led by Lord Balfour, Balfour, who was famous for his declaration in 1917 promising Palestine to the Jews. He combined his personal anti-Semitism, he didn't want Jews living next door, with a commitment to Christian Zionism and Britain's imperial interests. But if you map where the British Brothers League were active, especially in Shoreditch, Bethnal Green, Limehouse, against the later base of the British Union of Fascists, you can see the anti-Semitic imprint that was left in those communities. They had already shown that inclination towards those arguments. The other element that helped them in some ways was more contradictory. The poorest sections of East London included another large minority population, and that was the Catholic Irish. There were Catholic priests in several East End churches regularly making anti-Semitic comments, negative comments about Jews and communists. Mosley made a special effort to recruit the Irish in the East End. It was known that early in his career, Mosley had left the Tories after taking a progressive position on Ireland. However, the more trade unionised sectors of the Irish population, dockers, railway workers, they were becoming involved in anti-fascist activity. And some of them were recruited into the Communist Party, which was the strongest political force in East London taking an anti-fascist stand. From 1934 to 37, the peak period of fascist agitation in the East End, the Communist Party doubled in size nationally. In the East End, its numbers grew fivefold. And that they recruited a lot of Jews and also recruited a number of Irish people who encountered Jews there as comrades. The battle for the hearts and minds of the Irish community continued as the fascists increased their number of branches in East London between 34 and 36. They developed a wider set of street corner meetings, venues that were increasingly encroaching the Jewish areas around Whitechapel in a very threatening way. But they could also be found a bit further out than the Tower Hamlets area, because there were also street corner meetings in Plaistow, Hayday Road, Plaistow, Beckton Road, and on Wanstead Flats near Capel Road. As at first they were sending experienced fascists from their headquarters to speak at those meetings, but over time they built up a local set of speakers, and a number of those speakers were from the Irish Catholic community. One Jewish activist in the East End who crossed that divide easily between Jewish and Irish minority communities, and some of you may know of him, was a man called Max Levitas. He was a Jewish communist born in Dublin to Lithuanian Jewish immigrant parents. His father had been very active in the Tailors' Union in Dublin. Max's family moved to Glasgow when Max was in his early teens, and then to London's East End in the early 30s. He stayed in the East End until he died at the age of 103 a few years ago. If there's time in the discussion afterwards, I'll tell you a good story about Max, but we'll leave that for the moment. Stratford, West Ham, Forest Gate, East Ham all had large working class populations, but also significant growing elements of a suburban middle class. Fascist branches here included some wealthy and educated anti-Semites. A leading figure in the West Ham branch was Millicent Bullivant, who lived in Forest Gate. She was a true believer who had been part of the very first fascist group in Britain, calling itself the British Fascisti in the early 20s, well before Mosley formed his party. The East Ham branch had Dr. Evans, who had a medical practice in Harley Street. And the East Ham branch had attracted 500 people to a public meeting at the town hall in East Ham in 1934. There was also, from 1934, people in West Ham who were members and agitators of a rival fascist group, the Imperial Fascist League, a fanatically anti-Semitic organisation founded by Arnold Leese, a veterinary expert on camels, who had actually worked in, I only found this out today, he actually worked in East London as a vet for 3 years in the early 1900s, before going off to India and Kenya to study the diseases of camels there, and then settling in Lincolnshire. Oh, 10 minutes. I thought funny. Okay. I thought I started at 1:15, didn't I? Yeah, you said. Okay. I'm going to. Oh, I'll try and. All right. Okay. But anyway, Leese put it around that the British Union of Fascists, that Mosley was actually Jewish, and he used to call them the British Union of Fascists, but the IFL, the Imperial Fascist League, who had members in West Ham, their banner was a Union Jack with a white circle in the middle with a black swastika in it. Another sphere which I meant to show some pictures here. Oh, well, all right. Just a couple of quick pictures. There's Mosley with Mussolini, and there's Mosley on the march. This is Mosley on the march. This is what his people looked like when he was marching. Yeah. I thought it was Elon Musk. No, anyway, but yeah, another sphere where they were picking up support was among youth. They really pushed the generational politics line. They referred to their targeted enemies in the Labour, Tory, and Liberal leadership as the tired old gang, who needed to be got rid of, and it was youth that needed to come through. He also, this was if you look at the bottom one. It's a newspaper called Action, and it talks about Britain's youth shall not be massacred, Mosley for peace and people. And what he was saying, that they were the only party that was offering youth a chance to play their part in the nation in peacetime rather than wartime. And that was a very powerful sentiment when so many people had lost so many of their young boys as soldiers in the First World War. But early 1936, this is a very important moment. There's a change of name. It becomes the British Union of Fascists and National Socialists. And this is a change of supporting Mussolini to supporting Hitler. And up to then, the anti-Semitism of Mosley had mainly been focused on making accusations of what Jews allegedly do, not what they are. So they'd tell you about bad employers, bad landlords, harsh employers, price-cutting business rivals, people stealing your job, people making a claim for territory by dominating the residents in certain streets, people who insisted on using their mother tongue. But all these, anything that was considered bad by them, they would attach a Jewish name to it. Yeah? And they say that's why we're picking on that person, not because they're Jewish, but because of what they're doing. Yeah? But all that pretense went out the window after they took on the more zoological and biological, racial arguments of Hitler's Nazis. So as well as all those accusations, you'd have rhetoric on the street corners where they address hundreds of people at a time. And they'd say this about Jews: they're a species of subhumanity, rats and vermin from the gutters of Whitechapel, a pestilence, a cancer. And how do you get rid of a pestilence or a cancer? You just cut it out completely. This is an invitation to a genocidal view of anti-Semitism. And people hearing this would also take things into their own hands physically, and they would attack Jews. Yeah? And through 1936, there were physical attacks on Jews in the street every single day, and there were bricks going through windows, things being daubed on shops and houses. The community was full of fear. There was no help from the police. They felt the police were very much on the side of the fascists. The politicians spoke up for them in debates in Parliament. There were two debates in Parliament in the 1936 about anti-Semitic terror in the East End. But at the end of it, the Home Secretary is saying, well, the best thing would be is if everyone on all sides behaved better. Hopeless. Anyway, but in response to that, in July 1936, there's an initiative within the Jewish community, because the Jewish community were also very disappointed with appeals they were making to the wealthier Jews in the West End, and to the Jewish organisations there that said they represented the Jews, and to the Jewish Chronicle newspaper, where they got really nothing in response. And it was like they were living in different worlds. And so there was a workers' organisation, the Workers' Circle, which was originally a mutual aid society among Yiddish-speaking immigrant workers. They organised a conference, and out of that conference came a radical local organisation called the Jewish People's Council Against Fascism and Anti-Semitism. And that council had a very clear purpose. It was to mobilise all elements of the Jewish community proactively against the fascists, to build links with non-Jewish anti-fascists, and to build an anti-fascist majority in the area. And that's a really important thing. And all their public platforms, whether indoor or outdoor, always had at least one Jew and one non-Jew on the platform. Yeah. And at the end of 1936, there were posters going up in the East End. September 1936, there were posters promoting Oswald Mosley basically invading the East End. And 4 marching columns, 4 great meetings. And there was a petition. The people had about a week's notice of this. There was a petition. In 2 days, it got nearly 100,000 signatures. There were 60,000 Jews in 1 square mile around Aldgate, Whitechapel. there were a lot of non-Jews who signed that petition. Yeah? But just a bit of life advice, if you ever find yourself needing to take a petition to the British Home Secretary, whoever it is, and whether it's Labour or Tory, have a plan B in mind, because they may not like your petition. And that's what happened. They had a petition calling for that march not to take place. The Home Secretary says we have free speech and free movement in this country. What he meant was Mosley has free speech and his party has free movement. And so later that day, the Jewish People's Council were dishing out thousands of leaflets. And I thought I had one here, but it's, maybe not. Okay, but it's one that basically said, this march shall not take place. There we are. And it's addressed to citizens of London, not addressed to the Jews, citizens of London, saying this march must not take place. And all the different left groups were working around this, the different trade unions. There was a problem for the Communist Party because a few weeks earlier, the Communist Party had booked Trafalgar Square for that very same day, October the 4th, for the Young Communist League to have an Aid Spain rally. The Spanish Civil War had kicked off. Yeah? And that argument was raging all the week about where they should be. Should they be in Trafalgar Square or should they be in the East End? There's a saying in Yiddish which is, mit ein Tuchus kennt ihr nicht tanzen auf zwei Chassanas. It means, with one ass, you can't dance at two weddings. Anyway. But it was resolved on the Wednesday night. There was a kind of revolt within the party, from the grassroots of the party, saying the best way we can help our comrades in Spain is by stopping the fascists here in the East End. Friday's Jewish Chronicle, as ever, gave an urgent warning advising Jews to keep away from the route of a black shirt march. Jews who, however, innocently become involved in any disorders will be actively helping anti-Semitism and Jew-baiting. Unless you want to help the fascists, the Jew-baiters, keep well away. The Board of Deputies provided rabbis with messages to be read out on the synagogues on the Saturday the day before, telling congregants, stay indoors. Jewish youth clubs laid on extra football matches to try and divert the young men away. And one Cable Street veteran, Charlie Goodman, said to me, we prefer to tackle the fascists than tackle each other on a football field. The Labour, Liberal press, the Daily Herald, News Chronicle, Manchester Guardian appealed to people to stay clear of the event. But they all misjudged the mood of the people. Or rather, the peoples of the East End, Jewish, Irish, English, who ignored them and followed the call of the Jewish People's Council, the Communist Party, the Independent Labour Party, the Labour League of Youth, to come out and defend their area, not defend the Jewish area, but defend the area as a multicultural area. Yeah? And it was estimated there were anywhere between 100,000 and 300,000 on the street. A week later, the ILP brought out a pamphlet that said 300,000 workers say no to Mosley. But I think they added on a little bit there. Sometimes they count feet rather than heads. But anyway, But the two significant things about that day in Cable Street. One is that the place where the fascists were going to move their people to from their assembly point was Gardener's Corner at Aldgate. And there they were going to split into 4 columns to have open-air meetings when they've gone through the Jewish areas. Those meetings never happened. And at Gardener's Corner, there was such a thick blockade with thousands of people, they couldn't make any headway through that. So they're waiting down near the Tower of London to be told, can we move to Gardener's Corner yet? And they were getting the message, no, you're going to have to come in further south. And further south, there's this narrow road, Cable Street, the first 2/3 of which is almost entirely Jewish. The last third of it is almost entirely Irish. And remember, Mosley was trying to win the Irish against the Jews. On the day, lots of Irish people came down to the Jewish end of Cable Street to help build the barricades. Yeah? And I don't know what you use for barricades these days, but the first barricade in Cable Street was a truck turned over and it fitted inch perfect across Cable Street. And there were other barricades behind that, which the police couldn't see because they couldn't see over the truck. And so when the police eventually dislodged that and ran through, you'll see up in the windows, if you were able to look really closely at this, there's people up in the windows, and there were lots of women there, as well as women on the ground, but the women up there got things from their kitchen and rained it down on the police, and they were sort of getting resistance from ground level and from above, and they had to retreat and tell Mosley, you're not going through. Okay, last few things I want to say. About 5 minutes, is that all right? Okay. So, yeah. I've just lost my place here. Yeah. So it was a massive setback for the fascists that they had to abandon their march and head the other way, and it was a massive psychological boost for the anti-fascists. The fascists even described it as a humiliation. That was language they would never, ever use about things that they did. But they swore revenge, and there was a night of violence a few days later, which ended up with cars being set on fire and a couple of people being thrown through plate glass windows and things like that. They also recruited quite a lot of young people in the weeks after that at Cable Street. But these were young people who just wanted a bit of physical action. They were not ideological recruits, and they got bored pretty quickly and disappeared again. Yeah, but the real damage was in the inner circle around Mosley, where they were not just backstabbing each other; they were front stabbing each other and blaming each other. And some of them left the party. Some went all the way over to the anti-fascists. There's a guy called Charles Wegg Prosser, who was the leader of the Shoreditch branch of the BUF. He spent the last few years of the 1930s doing really good propaganda work for the anti-fascist cause. After the war, he stood as a Labour candidate several times in West London, but didn't get elected. And he was one of the founders of North Kensington Law Centre as well, which has mainly done a lot of work with migrant and refugee communities. But there was another factor that really helped, two things that really brought the community together and defeated the fascists. One was there were local elections in March 1937. The fascists stood in their three main areas, their strongest areas in East London. They promised to win, and the most they got was 23% in those areas. And Labour candidates won very easily. Mosley instinctively blamed the Jews, but actually these places where the elections were, in Limehouse, Shoreditch and Bethnal Green, were on the edges of the Jewish community. There were very few Jewish voters there. But the Jewish People's Council did loads of work in that area. The second thing was a most brilliant housing campaign. Run largely by the Communist Party, but also some Labour Party people, especially a radical churchman called Father Grosser. And they they knew that housing was one of the main recruiting points for fascism. They'd say to the Irish community in particular, you've got bad housing because the Jews have got good houses. You've got bad jobs because the Jews have got good jobs. And it was a lie, but both communities were really struggling. But it would be picked up by people with a sense of economic crisis. But what they did, they set up the Stepney Tenants Defence League, and it recruited people. It went there to the different blocks that were on the edges of the Jewish and Irish areas, and it said to them, what are the problems you've got in these houses? And they had a long list, and they encouraged them to form tenants committees, to put pressure on landlords, make demands, and if those demands were not met, when you felt strong enough, you could organise a rent strike. There were more than 20 rent strikes in the East End between 1938 and 39, where people made real gains, and they made them, and it was Jews and Irish people together making those gains. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit and come to my last point, which is how does all this relate to now? What are the similarities and differences? One of the slogans by protesters outside Olympia was, they have the millionaires, but we have the millions. And we live in these times when wealthy populists, very wealthy populists, are able to win support amongst the poor and disadvantaged members of society by speaking directly to their needs, while centrist politicians have grown ever more remote and ineffective, even than they were in the 1930s. Attempts to demonise and dehumanise the targets of racism and fascism. The use of conspiracy theories, and again we're seeing that more and more. All of those things are similar. Yeah? What's different? How racists and fascists recruit, how they win them over to their ideology, how they organise. So much of this is done online at the moment rather than in street corner meetings, and it's very effective stuff. And we have to think of some tactics to do something about that. The amount of demonisation by the political mainstream, which prepares the ground for the fascists today, particularly against the Muslim community today, I think that's much stronger. There was pretty bad anti-Semitism among individuals in the Tory party then, but it wasn't like the mainstreaming of Islamophobia that we've had for the last 20 years. The use of some big mobilisations, like Tommy Robinson, yeah, we can see that's a bit similar to what Mosley was doing. But the anti-fascists who dream of having one big, huge symbolic victory on the streets at the equivalent of Cable Street, that's not how they're going to be defeated. Yeah, we need to think what we can do in our localities, much more. It's not the big city centre confrontations. What we can do in our localities, and the strategy, and what I think is really important, are strategies like the strategies of the Jewish People's Council. How to build a sustainable anti-fascist majority in your area. And also there was a Communist Party strategy which was to try and, people that they knew were on a journey towards the fascists, they would find ways to interrupt them. Yeah, they would find, they didn't write them off as lost causes. Fascism was the problem rather than individual people running to the flag of fascists because there was nobody on their side and nobody to support them. And we need a much more holistic anti-racism and anti-fascism that goes just beyond the moral condemnations of racism. Racism is bad. No, really more than that. It ruins and destroys lives. And this is how it does it, And that's the kind of thing. But we have to also ally that with the fight for housing, the fight for education, the fight for social services, yeah? So I think I'll stop there.